I think it'd be helpful to put up this chart.
Yeah.
It's an old chart. A lot of the best stuff about the bank and fund is old. You have to go to the library. You have to dig out books because a lot of the critical analysis has just been like turned off. But this is an important chart, and I'll try to explain it so listeners can understand what we're looking at here. But the important thing is this from a book from basically 40, 50 years ago that describes how debt cycles work with World Bank loans. Okay, so the important thing for you to look at, Peter, is this bottom line, which is called net capital flow, and what you can see along the x-axis is the years. So if you look at net capital flow, obviously when a country first takes on a loan from the World Bank, as you see, it has positive net capital flow. It's getting the money that was loaned to them by the bank. So for the first 10 or 15 years, they're in the money, right? The dictator has a bunch of cash.
So this gives some perspective. That looks at, say, about, $75 million positive.
Yeah, exactly.
Within
Something
10 years.
like that. Right. So...
And hold on a second, just to ask. So it looks like it starts up like they've got like $25 million at the start. After 10 years, that's at 75. Is that the productivity that increases?
No. These are disbursements.
Oh, disbursements.
This is the money. This is, let's say they do a $500 million loan to help build a dam over 10 years.
Okay.
And then you have 40 years to pay it back. Usually these loans are like really long and they get delayed. So like there literally are loans that countries are still paying back from the 80s today, right? So the point is that in the first few years, the borrower country is in the black. Like it's getting a flow of money from the World Bank that it's using to do stuff with. But after, about, as you can see, about 8-9 years, that flow starts to peak and then it starts to go the other way. And then as you can see here, as you get around year 15 to year 20, it starts to go negative. And then it goes really negative. So
and the negative is that repayment?
Yes, that's repayment of interest, okay?
Holy shit.
So you have to pay back what they gave you plus the interest, okay? So the net capital flow eventually of the loan that is given to a poor country because of these high interest rates is super negative. Now, this is just an example of like one loan. But you have to understand
again, for the people listening, the net, what have we got? The net inflow peaks at around 75 million. The net outflow gets to nearly 800 million.
Yeah.
Negative.
Yeah, negative. Yeah. And we'll clip this for folks to kind of study and look at. It's kind of just like this. It's a very powerful image.
Well, we'll put the image in the show notes and it'll be on the video for people to see.
But let's move to like the actual data. So what does this mean? That's just one loan. There are thousands of these loans being poured into these countries in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s, in the 90s, et cetera. So I'll give you the outcome. So here's some data. So between 1970 and 2007, so that's from the end of the gold standard to the great financial crisis, the total debt service paid by poor countries to rich ones was $7.15 trillion. Okay, that's the debt service.
Against loans of how much?
That's just what they paid. Obviously, what was given to them was way less because that's principal plus interest.
So that's over 37 years.
That's over 37 years.
What's global GDP?
The annual GDP of the U.S. is around 20 trillion. So, I mean, it's a lot of money. But the point is, it's the equivalent of 71 Marshall Plans. Okay. So the Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Europe. We're talking many, 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 many multiples of that flowing from poor countries to rich countries. So basically, 1982 was the year when everything switched. So since 1982, the amount of money that has flowed from poor countries to rich countries has dwarfed the amount of aid and loans that are sent the other way. So here's some more data.
It is pure resource trade.
Yeah, it's pure resource trade. And people I didn't know this. So according to a study from 2012, that year, this gives you like a 1-year example more recently. Developing countries received 1.3 trillion. This included investment, aid, and income, everything. So all of the value that flowed to poor countries was 1.3 trillion. That same year, 3.3 trillion flowed out. Okay. So developing countries sent 2 trillion more to the rest of the world than they received. And then here's when you add up all the flows from 1980 to 2012. So in the preceding few decades, 16.3 trillion was drained out of the developing world. Okay. So these institutions were supposed to rescue and save these countries. And the outcome is the opposite. And the people who work at these institutions should have to answer to that. Why is this the case? And I guess what I would say is that, look, if it's a one-time problem, maybe it's a mistake. And a lot of the critics, I mean, this is where my thesis differs from the traditional criticism of the bank and the fund. The traditional criticism of the bank and the fund, some of it's libertarian, some of it's, libertarians, of course, say the whole thing's a waste and the taxpayer shouldn't pay for this absurd, expenditure of money in the third world that doesn't do anything. The Marxists, have other criticisms, but a lot of people have criticisms of these institutions. Stiglitz, there's all kinds of mainstream people who've said that the institutions aren't good. The problem is their argument is that there are too many mistakes made, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, like the bank and the fund are messing up. I don't think that's a sufficient answer. I think if you have clear resource drain every year since 1982, it's not a mistake. It can't be a mistake. I don't believe that. I think it's actually institutionally structured this way. It is a result of policies that squeeze poor countries and reduce their consumption at the expense of selling us stuff, and enormous amounts of debt along the way. Like that's literally what has occurred. So I don't accept the idea that this is some sort of like mistake or mismanagement or we screwed up. No. Like I think this was quite intentional.
What about the scenarios where we will see or hear about a country, maybe Lebanon as an example, which is suffering from massive inflation or economic collapse, and their only option appears to be to go to the World Bank? In those scenarios, what is the duty of the World Bank? Like, I'm always trying and see the good side.
It's like a drug. So debt is like a drug. It's like heroin. It's extremely addictive, and it's really hard to get off of, and it's very painful to get off of. But getting off of it is the right choice. Okay. So these countries should have made painful choices a long time ago, but they were convinced not to do so by the drug dealers, meaning the World Bank and the IMF. So, for example,
here's a free sample.
If you think the world is a free market, which I don't think it is, and we can get into that. But the point is that if you think the world's all free markets and capitalism, then there should be bankruptcies. People should be allowed to fail, right? There shouldn't be bailouts. The problem is that every time one of these poor countries defaulted or basically couldn't pay, what we should remember is that every liability is somebody else's asset, right? So when $100 million is loaned to the Congo, to Mobutu in the 70s, this horrible dictator who was ruling what was then called Zaire, and either the fund or the bank gave him $100 million for something. That loan is an asset on a Western bank's balance sheet, okay? So that Western bank does not want that to go to zero, okay? No way, okay? So then Mobutu says, well, I don't have the money. Sorry, I can't pay you back. So the IMF says, okay, here's some more money. And that way the original loan is preserved as an asset on the balance sheet, and Mobutu starts using the new money to pay back the old money. Basically, by the mid-1970s, American policymakers and people at the bank and the fund realized that the only way these poor countries would be able to pay the debt back was with more debt. It was a literal Ponzi scheme. Okay?
Right.
Literal Ponzi scheme.
But we do hear there's like certain conditions that comes with debt. So I seem to remember, I'd have to look it up, whether it was Cyprus or Greece during their crisis, that there were conditions of the World Bank loans where they had to change something like their tax rates had to change. I'm going to
give you the playbook.
But I'm trying to remember. But there are certain conditions that come with loans.
People call it the Washington Consensus.
Right.
But here's the playbook. I have 10 things that the IMF or the World Bank would do. The IMF would do this from inception, and the World Bank started increasingly doing this since 1980, which again is tying the loan, which again is not free to begin with, like means the poor country has to pay back more than what it received, okay, over time. In addition to that, they came with conditions, which is called structural adjustment. Okay, so that means usually a mixture of 10 things. The first one is currency devaluation. So again, this is like the doctor coming in to the patient who's sick and saying you have to do these things to get better. So the first thing they'll do is try to do currency devaluation. Again, all of these things are meant to like generate more exports so that the country can generate more hard currency to pay back its debt. Okay, so currency devaluation. Most Bitcoiners will understand that that's really bad for savers, right? That for individuals, right? Number two, the abolition or reduction of foreign exchange and import controls. Okay, so typically, like Western countries have controls on these sort of things.
Of course,
right? We like to say that we're all free market, but we're not. We have these controls. But when a poor country has a crisis, we say you have to get rid of all your controls, which of course leads to massive capital flight, right? All the rich people take their money out of the country, right? And that's what a lot of the drain that we speak of is corporations and rich people taking the money out, right? Number three, the shrinking of domestic bank credit. So this is particularly devastating to local businesses because let's say you're a small entrepreneur in, I don't know, Mexico in the 1980s. When the IMF came in and requested that the bank credit be shrunk, all of a sudden it's like really hard for you to get a loan to do your stuff. Meanwhile, the multinational corporations, they don't have any problems borrowing from abroad. So it like really hurts the little guy at the expense of the big one. Number four would be jacked up interest rates. So they tell the country to really jack up the interest rates, which of course, as we're finding out now in rich countries, really hurts the economy and really hurts people, hurts a lot of people, okay? Number five, they increase taxes, big time, all kinds of taxes. Number six, an end to any like subsidies on food or energy. So again, these are poor countries, and I'm kind of a free market guy. For sure, I love capitalism, but like when you have a country like Sri Lanka that's been for a long time giving free rice to its people, and you have Britain, which is giving free healthcare to its people, say you can't do that anymore, that's a double standard. And that's not a free market, okay? So you have this country that's used to free rice, which again may not be the best economic decision, but you know what? Like it's helping people in a way. People can eat. All of a sudden they can't eat. They get really pissed, right? So protests, etc. Wage ceilings. So this one's tough. So even though the prices of goods go way up after structural adjustment, the IMF says that you can't raise wage, you can't do any minimum wage type stuff. So you have to put a ceiling on the wage, okay? The whole point is to like squeeze more out of the countries without the workers getting more. It's kind of like a way of making sure the labor share in economy. The IMF policies are designed to make the share of labor in an economy be as small as possible, okay? To screw over the laborers, basically. Then there's restrictions on government spending, especially in healthcare and education. So again, I don't think it's the greatest idea for the government to be in charge of these things. But you gotta understand, in like the late 70s, these African countries had free healthcare. A lot of them had free healthcare. Now, was it good? Probably not. But to go from free healthcare to then no free healthcare, and it's really expensive, is really bad and led to massive reduction in child and mother mortality. Okay, deterioration in those rates. Okay, this is all like research has shown this. Number 9, favorable legal conditions and incentives for multinational corporations.
There we go.
So there'll be subsidies, tax breaks, all kinds of things for giant corporations from our countries to go in and take all the stuff.
It's asset stripping.
Finally, the fire sale or garage sale on state enterprises and claims on natural resources. So what are these governments are going bankrupt, they have to pay back their debt. One of the things they might do is sell off the national oil company or whatever to a foreign company at by the way, at a fraction of what it costs to make. So you get to come in and like pick up the pieces. So structural adjustment meant any combination of these 10 things, often all 10, in many cases. And again, if you look at the IMF is actually quite transparent in terms of, it's not transparent in a lot of ways, but it's transparent, and there's a website you can go to. And if you just Google IMF history and insert the name of the country, it'll show you the entire history. So if you want to, for example, do Argentina, do IMF history Argentina in Google. Check this out, Pete. So this is all of the IMF loans to Argentina. So you can think about this as every time the government in Argentina had like a crisis, starting in 1958, you see over there the amount agreed and the amount drawn. Those are the loans that were taken.
So 81 billion agreed.
Yeah, so at the beginning it was 75 million, and most recently, only 4 years ago,
40 billion.
Argentina got the single largest loan from IMF in its history, 41 billion, almost $41 billion. Right?
When it says amount drawn, is that how much of that they've used?
Yeah, exactly. They've actually.
So they've still got access to another 9 billion if they want it.
As of right now, yeah. And they took $31 billion.
And amount outstanding is how much they still owe. Hold on. Hold on. So
No. So the IMF, the amount agreed column is just the IMF says we'll give you 40 billion, and the Argentina doesn't have to take the whole 40 billion.
Yeah,
they've taken 31.9 billion.
but that's how much debt they owe back. So every time there's a new loan, it essentially repays the old loan.
So see the 40 billion paid off all the old stuff.
Paid off all the old stuff. That's
but they still owe 31 billion.
Yeah.
So and I'll give you the
So
numbers.
essentially they're wrapping it up into a new loan.
Yeah, but check this out. This is insane. So basically, like, if you look at the total debt owed by poor countries, we call it the external public debt. Okay, that was $46 billion in the year 1970. Today, it's 8.7 trillion. So in the past 50 years, countries like India, the Philippines, and the Congo now owe their former colonial masters 189 times the amount they owed in 1970. They've paid $4.2 trillion on interest payments alone since 1980. And for every $1 of aid that developing countries receive, they lose $24 in net outflows.
This is they're loan sharks.
Yeah, I mean, they're drug dealers, they're loan sharks.
Loan sharks. The behavior of loan sharks is to keep you permanently indebted. It's to come to like the traditional loan shark is to knock on the door. It's like, do you need £50 to borrow to get you through to payday? Yeah, I need £50. Great. By the time next payday comes, you owe £200. You're permanently in debt. You can never pay off the loan.
No, I've got, and I have to read this quote. I know that I know that you and Saifedean are not the best friends, but I will say the guy has an incredible chapter in his book, The Fiat Standard, on this. And let me read this.
Okay, no, I'm happy to read it.
When World Bank planning inevitably fails and the debts cannot be repaid, the IMF comes in to shake down the deadbeat countries, pillage their resources, and take control of political institutions. It's a symbiotic relationship between the two parasitic organizations that generates a lot of work, income, and travel for the misery industry's workers at the expense of the poor countries that have to pay for it all in loans. The more one reads about it, the more one realizes how catastrophic it's been to hand this class of powerful yet unaccountable bureaucrats an endless line of fiat credit and unleash them on the world's poor. The arrangement allows unelected foreigners with nothing at stake to control and centrally plan entire nations' economies. Indigenous populations are removed from their lands, private businesses are closed to protect monopoly rights, taxes are raised, properties confiscated, tax-free deals are provided to international corporations, while local producers pay ever higher taxes and suffer from inflation to accommodate their government's fiscal incontinence. As part of the debt relief deals signed with the misery industry, governments were asked to sell off some of their most prized assets. This included government enterprises, but also natural resources and entire swaths of land. So that's what we've been talking about. I mean, these people are basically debt enforcers. Someone wrote a book in the 80s, which I thought had the brilliant title, The Debt Squads. You know, not the debt squads, they're the debt squads. Yeah. So the point is that these institutions have forever changed the shape of these societies. And they've done so largely in league with dictators, which is why I got interested. And I want to talk about that.
Just a couple of questions before we get into dictators. Okay, so firstly, aid is... Are we essentially have I been gaslighted my entire life with the word aid by the belief that aid sounds like a good word? Like aid, we're giving aid to a country. Is it just a fucking loan?
This is not a conversation about the effectiveness of actual aid. That's a different conversation.
But is aid actually a loan? Is it a gift or is it a loan?
So ODA includes both. Official development assistance includes both aid and loans. Let's just put it this way. I still think it's a good idea for people to be charitable and to help people at a time of need.
Agreed.
Okay? And there are very effective ways to do that in different ways. And even the US government still at times can do that. Like there will be a natural disaster and we'll use our army to go in and like feed people. And that's helpful. Okay. The percentage of assistance that is pure aid versus loans is very small. Okay. So when we talk about assistance going into these countries, it's mainly loans that need to be paid back. Now, in the last couple decades, the IMF and World Bank came under a lot of scrutiny. So they started to change some of their policies to make it look like they were like less exploitative. So now there's like a category of what are called highly indebted poor countries, or like HIPCs or whatever. Now these countries can qualify for what's called like debt relief, which often means like the loans they get are interest free. And they can be like repaid over a really long period of time. But, you know, it's only adding to the debt pile. And not all of the loans they get are in this way. So again, I mean, all you need to see to understand the failure of the bank and the fund is the fact that the debt of the poor countries has gone exponentially higher than it used to be. So remember, again, just zoom out. Like 50, 60 years ago, these countries, they were poor. It's true. They were poor, but they weren't debt slaves. Okay. They didn't owe money to other countries. Today, the number one thing they have to do when these governments sit down to pay their monthly bill, essentially, is service debt. That is like a really broken world.